Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. If you've been a fan of my channel for any length of time, you might know that I love classic television. MASH, The Brady Bunch, The Facts of Life, you name it, I've probably watched at least one episode and in the rare case gotten completely obsessed with it. Another classic show that I love, that I very rarely get to talk about, is Emergency, mainly because it seems to have disappeared from being aired or streamed anywhere except one obscure TV channel on Saturdays. Emergency was a television series created by Jack Webb, the guy who created Dragnet, basically pioneering the entire police procedural genre, and starred as Detective Joe Friday as a spin-off to Adam 12, another police procedural that Webb created. Dude was basically the Dick Wolf of early television. No, scratch that. Dick Wolf is the Jack Webb of modern crime dramas. Emergency sought to introduce America and the television-watching public to paramedics. While you might know what they are now, back in the early 70s, paramedics as we know them today didn't exist. Sure, in a military context, like on MASH, who had ambulances and medics to take wounded and sick to the hospital. But in the States, however, not so much. Because there weren't specifically dedicated people to treat them, the most that they could do was get them into a vehicle and send them to a hospital. And as such, there was a pretty high mortality rate since a lot of seriously injured or sick people need immediate treatment and won't survive the trip to the hospital. They did studies, discovered that soldiers on the battlefield had better medical care because of the methods they used in sending medics to the injured people to keep them alive long enough to get full treatment, and they got an idea. Hence the Wadsworth-Townsend Act, which started pilot programs to train paramedics that could provide some medical treatment to the wounded under supervision from a medical professional, and use a radio to get medical recommendations from the local hospital. Los Angeles was one of the first places to start doing it, and when Webb was developing the series, he initially intended to focus on fire rescues, but didn't think that it had enough material, and when meeting with the LA County Fire Department, they suggested that he dig into the paramedic program, and thus, in 1972, Emergency was born. The show starred Randolph Mantooth, who has the coolest name ever, and Kevin Teague as Johnny Gage and Roy DeSoto, two firemen who are trained as paramedics as part of the pilot program, and in addition to their usual fire work, they also provide medical attention when necessary, in conjunction with the local hospital, Rampart General, where they would hand patients over to the skilled staff, including Dr. Kelly Brackett, owner of the most awesome hair ever, played by Robert Fuller, Dr. Joe Early, played by Bobby Troop, and no-nonsense nurse Dixie McCall, played by Julie London, who was actually Bobby Troop's real-life wife and Jack Webb's real-life ex-wife. The episodes usually consisted of a main storyline for Gage and DeSoto, a personal subplot for one or both of them, along with subplots that would feature the firehouse, other firefighters, or the staff at Rampart, along with following each patient through the initial emergency, through their treatment or release, and sometimes death. And sometimes those patients would be famous or soon-to-be famous people, like Nick Nolte, Adam West, John Travolta, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. It's legitimately one of my favorite TV shows, and the show was popular enough and served to properly introduce Americans to the concept of paramedics, since while the profession was nearly unheard of when the show began in 1972, by the time it ended in 1979, paramedics were a fairly common thing. Naturally, when a show like this exists, there's tie-in material. There was a Saturday morning cartoon, much like The Brady Kids, which featured Gage and DeSoto and a bunch of children doing rescues, and there was a short-lived comic series in 1976 from Charlton Comics, the company that's responsible for the creation of, among others, Captain Atom, The Question, and my favorite superhero ever, the Ted Kord Blue Beetle. When I found out that these existed, I was excited because they had short prose stories in them that I wanted to look at, like I did with the Dan Garrett Blue Beetle stories, but once I got them, I realized that not only were the stories super short and didn't have anything to talk about, but the comics themselves were pretty interesting too, so I wanted to talk about the entire issue. So I decided that I'm going to try my hand at a comic review once again, and hopefully this one will turn out good. I've got scans of all 4 and physical copies of the 1st and 3rd issue, but I don't want to blow my entire supply on the first go, so we're just going to look at the 1st issue. This is All New Emergency number 1. The cover is pretty good, though it's one of those old-school action-packed covers that depicts a scene that didn't actually happen in the comic itself, but it's still decent, and the artwork was done by Joe Staton, a notable comics artist who, in addition to working for Charlton, has worked for the Big Two. The artwork isn't bad, but I don't really think that DeSoto looks like Teague here. Gage looks good, though. We've got Gage and DeSoto in full firefighter gear saving a woman from high-voltage electrical equipment, with their helmets correctly reflecting that they're with Engine 51. I don't know why it's called All New Emergency, but I'd assume that they were trying to ensure that you didn't think that this was just an adaptation of an episode of the show. So overall, it's a good cover that's got an exciting scene on it to draw in potential readers, though I'd guess that most people bought this on the merit of it being a tie-in to their favorite TV show. I know I did, and I paid a lot more than 30 cents for it. Anyway, on to the issue itself. Before we get to the plot, I just want to take time to note that the issue's art, apart from the cover, is done by John Byrne. Yes, that John Byrne. So we're in for a real treat with this one. John Byrne has done the art for nearly every major superhero of both DC and Marvel over the last half-century. It's also written by Joe Gill, another major figure in comics history, notable for co-creating Captain Atom, Peacemaker, and Judo Master at Charlton. The story is called Hot Cargo and starts, like many episodes of the show, with DeSoto and Gage rushing in their ambulance to the latest fire, which is at a chemical warehouse. They locate some injured people and get them prepped to be sent to Rampart. At Rampart, Dr. Brackett and Dixie are attempting to treat a patient with nausea and severe radiation burns on his hands and forearms. Though they can't get the patient, David to divulge where the hell he got the burns, and the patient isn't very cooperative. "Don't try to con me, Doc. Just fix me up and let me out of this joint." "We have no medication for stupidity, mister."
Stupidity isn't a virus, but it sure is spreading like one.
Brackett tries to get in contact with other authorities to see if there's any missing radioactive material out in the city, and the firefighters attempt to put out the blaze before the entire block goes up, there being highly volatile chemicals being stored in the warehouse. Gage pulls an injured fireman out of the blaze with minor injuries, and the chief informs them that it was arson, since they found gasoline cans in an office and destroyed manifests. But that also creates a new problem, since they don't know exactly what the hell is being stored in there, and it could potentially blow up at any moment. 2 cops are sent to locate the warehouse's owner, but when they arrive at his house, they find out from a neighbor that he's on vacation and is up in Spruce Lake. The cops speed away and hightail it up to Spruce Lake and get the owner, DeWinter, to come with them back to the warehouse. He tells them that he had acetylene and oxygen stored in there, which, if heated, could go off like a bomb. The cops narrowly avoid flattening a child chasing a ball into the street, because apparently mid-70s California parents didn't teach their kids to look both ways, as they rush back to the warehouse, where the blaze is pretty much under control when they arrive. DeWinter looks around and finds something unaccounted for: radium chloride. Of course, this is the work of Professor Shrapelli and his radioactive salt. I mean, this is Charlton, so it is entirely possible for them to call in Dan Garrett to investigate as the Blue Beetle, so... Gage and DeSoto inform the chief about the danger of the radium, and Gage hypothesizes that the arson was a cover-up for whoever stole the radium. That stuff's worth a lot of bread, and fire's a dandy way of covering his tracks. Could be, Johnny, could be. It's a job for the cops now. You know, that's just the way. Every time something interesting happens, someone else pulls jurisdiction. Gage and DeSoto head out and drop in at Rampart to check in on the firefighter that Gage pulled out of the blaze. Gage asks Dixie about his guy, and Dixie tells him that the guy was fine and has already been sent home. She also mentions Davin, the guy with the radiation burns, which piques Gage's interest. He confronts Davin, but he's not talking. But that's okay, because Gage doesn't need him to talk. "Where are his clothes, Dixie?" "Right over there. Better wear gloves. He was filthy." The paramedic examined the clothing, and completely ignored what Dixie said and picked up the dirty irradiated clothes with his bare hands. And this guy is one of the first paramedics in the city. Truly, they are in good hands. Gage goes to tell all this to a police officer to aid in the investigation, and then he heads off with DeSoto, splitting up because Gage wants to keep looking into Davin, and DeSoto has to head home for his wife's birthday party, which to me seems like the writer didn't know how to write DeSoto and wanted a solo adventure for Gage, which I don't really mind because Johnny Gage was always my favorite character. Gage picks up a Geiger counter from Supply and goes to Davin's apartment, tracking the radium chloride. No one is home, so Gage and his cop buddy Hall go in, finding a heavy radiation signature coming from the closet. The Geiger counter read higher near the closet. Then it went wild as he passed it close to a cheap suitcase. "I'm probably getting a heavy dose of radiation right now." Probably should have picked up a hazmat suit or something from Supply, too. Well, live and learn. He searches through the suitcase, finding a Spider-Man costume? I mean, John Byrne has done art for Spider-Man before, so it's possible, but at second glance it could also be a plaid shirt and a blue sheet that Gage picked up together. Dan Garrett could appear in this, but there is no way that Davin is a disguised Peter Parker. Gage only finds some of the radium, but he calls a radiation specialist to the apartment anyway, because the place is saturated with the residual. Gage runs out of the apartment and spots a black and white passing by. "Hold it! Pull over, Steve. I know that guy. He's a paramedic. Sage or Cage or something." For the love of God, comic, do not give Hollywood ideas. We already got Dax Shepard as John Baker. We do not need Nick Cage as Johnny Gage. He asks them about Davin, and they tell him about Davin's usual hangout spot, sending Gage to a restaurant, and then to a closed auto body shop. Gage goes in with the Geiger counter to investigate. The paramedic went closer to look in the dirty window nearest to him. Some boxes covered in a canvas tarp could be... "Hold it, Gage, you are no longer alone." "Hold it, Gage, you are now narrating yourself." Some dude knocks Gage out with a slapjack and takes his wallet, badge, and the Geiger counter. Hall takes him to Rampart to get checked out, where Brackett and Dixie tell him that Davin escaped by stealing an orderly's clothes and walking out. Dixie tells him about the grave seriousness of the situation. "You know how radiation poisoning works, John. The patient often experiences periods without symptoms, but the sickness always comes back. Davin may already be beyond our help, and now he's out there, possibly contaminating others." Gage and Hall head back to the restaurant, Leo's Grill, but not before Gage calls DeSoto to tell him that he can't make Joanne's party because of the investigation, and DeSoto gives him a tip to be careful at the bar. Gage and Hall rush back to the bar to find Davin. Davin was sitting in a corner booth, shaking uncontrollably, his bandaged hands unable to even pick up his glass. "I know you, you're the creep from the hospital." No, he's the paramedic. The creep was the old dude in bed 3 who kept pinching the nurses' asses. "You took some of that radium chloride for yourself, didn't you? But to do that, you had to handle the glass with your bare hands. Don't you dig it, man? You're a walking bomb!" And we're not talking Seltzerberg, I mean Chernobyl. A few other dudes catch wind of what Gage says and rush out, planning on moving the stolen radium from the garage, now that they know how harmful it is. Gage and Hall call Davin an ambulance and send his ass back to Rampart, and 2 cops call in a warrant for the auto body shop. But they also head over because if they're in the act of moving stolen goods, they don't need the warrant. That's our cue, we're going with them. Those 2 can check out Becker's garage. Yeah, but there may be injuries, and it's my job to pick up the pieces. Also, this is my collar, I want in. There's a shootout, because drama, and they collar Davin's buddies. Gage manages to recover the Geiger counter, his badge and wallet, but the guy who mugged him still took the cash that was in the wallet. Hey, at least they didn't get his credit card. I don't think he wants to spend another day and a half trying to get a hold of Gloria Truelove to cancel it. The comic ends back at Rampart as we get one more glimpse of Davin. Back in the emergency ward, Dixie McCall watched the life ebb from James Davin, the man who was dying because of greed. Avoid any further contact, Dixie. There's absolutely nothing more we can do for him. It's so stupid, Kelly. Why do people wreck their lives like this? We'll be right back with more of the show. Do you like geek and gamer gear delivered right to your door? Are you a fan of Black Scarab Films? If so, then you're in luck, because this week's video is brought to you by Loot Crate. Loot Crate, if you don't know what it is a monthly subscription service that delivers geek and gamer gear right to your door. Or mailbox, as the case may be. Because I have a dog, the mail carrier tends to just toss the package towards the door and hightail it out of there. She's really sweet once you get to know her, I promise. Where was I? Oh right, Loot Crate. Just for you Black Scarab Films fans, all 6 of you. Hi Mom. Loot Crate is offering 10% off new subscriptions if you go to this link. Try lootcrate.com/BlackScarabFilms and enter the code BRIDGE10. This month's theme is Transformation and contains items from Marvel Comics, Naruto Shippuden, Adventure Time, Transformers, and Alita Battle Angel, which is that movie that looks like Ready Player One, but is apparently really good. If you go to that link by the 19th of the month, you get that crate. And if you're curious as to what to expect, I've got January's crate right here, because I'm not only doing a sponsorship deal, but I'm also a subscriber. That's a Hair Club for Men reference for you. We only do relevant jokes on this show. So January's theme was binge, and it included, among other things, a Black Mirror t-shirt, which has icons on it that correspond to episodes of the show, like USS Callister and White Christmas, which are 2 of my favorite episodes of the series, which is hard to see because it's a black-on-black design, but it is pretty cool. It also had a pair of Friends-themed socks featuring the Sunglasses Turkey, also neat. A Futurama blind box figure that ended up being Calculon, the greatest robot actor to ever live, though personally I was hoping for Zoidberg. It also came with a SpongeBob SquarePants calendar, which to my disappointment does not feature a month dedicated to Sweet Victory, but it does feature Annoy Squidward Day, which is actually today if you're watching this on the day it was uploaded to Patreon, and yesterday if you're watching it on the day it was uploaded to YouTube. And the final thing in the crate is a USS Callister Black Mirror pin, which gets you some e-comics, the first 2 issues of The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. So if you've been on the fence and like me wanted to wait until you can get a discount on your first month, there is no better time. The link again is trylootcrate.com/BlackScarabFilms, and the code is BRIDGE10. Happy looting! And we're back. Anyone else get the feeling I own too many of these? But I said earlier that there were prose stories too. The one in issue number 1 is titled The Victim, and concerns Gage and DeSoto heading out on a job and finding an old man, Walter Edmonds, in the middle of a massive retirement complex fire. They get him out and call up Joe Early, in his only appearance in this issue, at Rampart to get advisement over what to do. They follow Early's instructions and stabilize him enough to get in the ambulance and head over to Rampart. Gage and DeSoto talk about the old guy, having gotten some info on him from the landlady. He kept to himself most of the time and didn't have friends, and the 2 paramedics decide to take it upon themselves to give him 2 new friends. Gage finds him a new place to stay because, well, the old one was a little fire damaged, and Dixie smiles at his kindness. A few days later, Gage takes Walter to a Dodgers game, and after that, they go fishing, since Walter had mentioned wanting to fish. Gage wants Walter to get the most out of life, so he has no problem doing all the fun stuff. A few weeks later, he goes to take Walter out, but finds DeSoto's car outside. Gage goes inside and finds DeSoto trying to invite Walter to a barbecue, but Walter says that he's too tired and wants to stay in. When the paramedics ask why, he tells them that while he's had a lot of fun going out with Gage and a lot of fun going out with DeSoto and his family, he just can't keep up with the pace. The story ends with the 2 paramedics agreeing to go easier on Walter. They'll still stop in to talk, but they won't drag him out every day of the week. And that was All New Emergency number 1, a pretty decent comic that is a pretty decent representation of the series it's tied into. The comic doesn't exactly follow the plot of the typical episode of the show with the personal plot and the main plot and the intersection between. There's a lot less Rampart than usual and no unique plot for them, following up on any patients apart from Daven. Usually you'd have the paramedics drop someone off and Brackett, Dixie, and Early would investigate their medical problems on their own. In fact, apart from the prose story, Joe Early doesn't even appear in the main comic. And it's not even like the series swapped out between Brackett and Early depending on the episode. Bobby Troup appeared just as much as everyone else. Same with how DeSoto gets a much reduced role, and apart from the Chief, we never see any other firefighters like Chet Kelly or Lopez. There's also no last 11th hour disaster. The show usually dedicated the last 10 minutes of the episode to a major disaster, pile-up, construction accident, like the main warehouse fire would have usually been seen at the end. I don't know why, I always found it strange, but it was something neat to look forward to after everything was wrapped up. At first I thought it might be because most of the episodes I've seen have been from the early years of the show, and maybe it was different in 76, but no, the show's format was in place from the beginning to the very end. I also feel like they wasted time following the cops to find the warehouse owner, almost like padding in a comic that didn't really need it, since all they needed was a plot for Rampart or a personal plot for Gage or DeSoto, and they'd have made the pages up. Maybe DeSoto could have tagged along to balance out Gage's solo adventure, and that would have made it feel like it worked, because otherwise it slows the story down immensely with characters that aren't from the show. I guess the real question is, does the comic justify its existence? Is this a story that couldn't have been told on the show? Not really, because I think the show probably could have done this episode in live action. But regardless, I still highly recommend it for fans of Emergency, because it's further adventures of our favorite LA paramedics. Though if you're gonna go the extra mile like I did to track down a physical copy of this one, just be aware that if you're a fan of Joe Early or Roy DeSoto, you're gonna be disappointed with this issue. But if you're a huge Johnny Gage fan like I am, you'll like it. I'm sure Early shows up in one of the other three, though. It does have the general feel of the show, which many comic adaptations fail at, and the art is top-notch. But then again, I'm biased about that because it's John friggin' Byrne, and he is a legend. The writing is decent, even if some parts confused me, and it was an ultimately enjoyable story with a good moral. Don't mess with radioactive material or you'll die. And I think that's a lesson that we can all use in our daily lives. The prose story was good too, but there wasn't really a lot there and nothing to really poke fun at. Gage and DeSoto do a good deed and end up going a tad too far. Still a good read, just not really video-worthy. I sort of wish that they had used the story to handle the firehouse shenanigans, but what are you gonna do? Next week, I'm gonna try something new. A video essay based on an actual essay I wrote for a film class last year. See you next time. Hey, check it out, The Many Concussions of Johnny Gage.